3 years ago, I bought 20 acres of mountain paradise 2 hours north of our HOA-controlled suburb. The moment I first saw the old log cabin nestled between towering pines, I knew I had found my sanctuary. After 15 years of Margaret Wilson and her HOA board controlling every aspect of our neighborhood lives, this place represented pure freedom. The cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and silence. No nosy neighbors peering over fences. No citations for leaving garbage cans out 12 hours too long. No mandatory paint color approvals or lawn height measurements. Just me, the mountains, and blessed peace. I spent every weekend that first year restoring the cabin with my own hands. I repaired the stone fireplace, rebuilt the wraparound porch, and installed solar panels for off-grid independence. The rustic interior featured exposed beams, a cozy loft bedroom, and windows that framed mountain views like living paintings. Every nail I drove and every board I sanded felt like an act of rebellion against the suffocating control I faced at home. The cabin became my refuge from Margaret's tyranny. While she spent her days measuring grass height with rulers and issuing fines for mailbox violations, I would escape to my mountains and remember what freedom felt like. The scent of pine needles and wood smoke replaced the smell of suburban conformity. The sound of wind through trees drowned out the constant hum of leaf blowers and HOA complaints. On summer evenings, I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee watching deer graze in the meadow below. The stars shone brighter here, unmarred by streetlights and strip mall signs. This was healing. This was sanctuary. This was mine. But even paradise has its shadows. During my third month of ownership, I began noticing small things that did not belong. Fresh tire tracks in the soft dirt near my gate. Cigarette butts that were not mine scattered around the fire pit. A window latch that I remembered securing was mysteriously unlocked. The first time I found footprints circling the cabin perimeter, I convinced myself they belonged to curious hikers. The mountains attracted all kinds of visitors, and maybe someone had simply wandered onto my property by mistake. But the prints returned every few weeks, always the same pattern, always suggesting someone was studying my home rather than just passing through. One October morning, I discovered that someone had been inside. Nothing was stolen, but subtle signs of intrusion were everywhere. A chair moved slightly from its usual position. Cupboard doors left barely ajar. My coffee mug sitting in the sink when I distinctly remembered washing and putting it away. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. Someone had been watching my routine, learning my schedule, and entering my sanctuary when they knew I would be away. The peaceful isolation I had treasured suddenly felt vulnerable and exposed. My fortress of solitude had become a stage for unknown visitors who felt entitled to trespass whenever they pleased. That night, I installed my first security camera above the front door. The motion-activated system would send alerts to my phone and record everything in high definition. If someone was violating my privacy, I would find out who, and I would make sure they regretted it. Sleep did not come easily anymore. Every sound outside the cabin made me wonder if my uninvited guests had returned. The sanctuary I had worked so hard to create was being poisoned by the knowledge that others felt free to treat it as their own playground. Little did I know that the worst violation was still to come. 3 weeks later, I drove up the mountain road with eager anticipation. Work had been brutal, and I desperately needed the peace my cabin provided. But as I rounded the final bend, my heart sank. Empty beer cans glittered in the afternoon sunlight, scattered across my front yard like broken promises. The porch I had lovingly restored was littered with cigarette butts and food wrappers. My handcrafted rocking chairs had been moved into a circle around a makeshift fire pit built with stones stolen from my garden border. Someone had used my property as their personal party venue, and they had not bothered to clean up afterward. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door key. Inside, the violation was even worse. Empty bottles covered my kitchen counter. Muddy footprints tracked across the hardwood floors I had refinished by hand. The couch cushions were stained with spilled drinks, and someone had used my bathroom without basic courtesy. But the discovery that made my blood boil was in the bedroom. My personal belongings had been disturbed. Dresser drawers hung open, and my clothes were scattered across the bed. These people had not just partied in my space. They had invaded my most private areas with complete disregard for boundaries. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and accessed the security camera app. The footage from the previous weekend would reveal everything. As the video loaded, I prepared myself for confirmation of what I already suspected. What I saw was worse than anything I had imagined. Margaret Wilson, the HOA president who had made my neighborhood life miserable for years, was leading a group of 20 people onto my property like she owned it. She pointed and gestured, directing others where to set up their party supplies. Her familiar voice carried across the recording as she told her guests to make themselves at home. "This little cabin is perfect for our gatherings," Margaret announced to her followers. "The owner is never here on weekends anyway. We might as well put it to good use." The casual entitlement in her voice made me sick. She spoke about my property like it was a public facility that existed for her convenience. Her guests laughed and nodded, apparently seeing nothing wrong with trespassing and theft of services. I watched in horror as Margaret opened my front door with a key I had never given her. She had somehow obtained access to my sanctuary and was treating it like her personal vacation rental. The violation felt deeper than mere trespassing. This was systematic invasion and abuse of my private space. The party footage showed them using my furniture, my dishes, my bathroom facilities, and my utilities without permission or payment. They left messes everywhere and showed no concern for property damage. Empty bottles were left on my antique wooden tables, leaving permanent ring stains. Cigarettes were extinguished directly on my porch railings, burning holes in the wood. But the moment that shattered my heart was when Margaret stood in my living room, drink in hand, and declared, "We should do this every weekend. This place is wasted on someone who barely uses it." Her words echoed in my mind as I surveyed the destruction around me. This was not just a one-time mistake or youthful prank. This was calculated exploitation by someone who believed her position of authority gave her rights to other people's property. The emotional impact hit me like a physical blow. This cabin represented years of dreams, savings, and hard work. Every board, every nail, every carefully chosen decoration reflected my vision of sanctuary and peace. Seeing it violated by the same person who controlled every aspect of my neighborhood life felt like having my soul ransacked. Margaret had not just stolen my property, she had stolen my sanctuary. The one place where I could escape her control had been contaminated by her presence and her entitled attitude. The peaceful refuge I had created was now tainted with the knowledge that she felt free to invade it whenever she chose. I sat on my damaged couch and cried tears of rage and betrayal. But beneath the hurt, something harder was forming. Margaret Wilson had made the biggest mistake of her authoritarian career. She had declared war on the wrong person's sanctuary. And she had no idea what was coming next. Monday morning, I marched into the HOA office with printed screenshots and video evidence. Margaret sat behind her desk like a queen on her throne, surrounded by violation notices and paint color samples. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive blazer screamed authority and control. "Margaret, we need to talk," I said, placing the evidence in front of her. She glanced at the photos with complete indifference. No shame, no embarrassment, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just cold calculation as she processed being caught in the act. "Oh, that little cabin of yours," she said dismissively. "Lovely property. We had a wonderful time there." Her casual admission stunned me. No denial, no attempt to explain or justify. Just brazen acknowledgement that she had violated my property rights without a second thought. "You broke into my private property," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You held an unauthorized party and left it destroyed. You had no permission to be there." Margaret leaned back in her chair with a condescending smile. "Permission? I am the HOA president. I have authority over property matters in this community. Your cabin affects neighborhood property values, so it falls under my jurisdiction." The sheer audacity of her response left me speechless. She was claiming HOA authority over property that was not even in the HOA jurisdiction, located 2 hours away in a different county. Her delusion of power had reached dangerous levels. "That property is not in this HOA," I said. "You have no authority there whatsoever. What you did was criminal trespassing and breaking and entering." "Good luck proving that," Margaret replied with a smirk. "And good luck finding anyone who will take your word over mine. I have been serving this community for 8 years. I have credibility and connections." Her threat was clear. She was using her position to intimidate me into silence, confident that her authority would protect her from consequences. But I had something she did not expect: video evidence. "I have security footage of everything," I said, showing her the recorded video on my phone. "Every moment of your illegal party is documented in high definition." For the first time, Margaret's confident expression faltered. She watched herself on camera, clearly recognizing the legal implications of documented trespassing. But instead of backing down, she doubled down with threats. "Delete that footage immediately," she demanded. "And if you even think about pursuing this legally, you will regret it. I control every aspect of life in this neighborhood. I can make your existence here very uncomfortable." "You mean more uncomfortable than it already is," I shot back. Margaret stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You have no idea what I can do to you. Surprise HOA inspections, daily violation notices, legal action for every minor infraction. I will make your life hell if you do not drop this immediately." "And my cabin?" I asked. "Are you planning to continue your illegal parties?" "That cabin is perfect for community gatherings," she said with renewed arrogance. "We will continue using it whenever we see fit. Consider it your contribution to neighborhood morale." The entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. She was not just refusing to apologize. She was promising to continue violating my property while threatening retaliation if I tried to stop her. Margaret Wilson had revealed herself as someone who viewed other people's boundaries as personal inconveniences. "You are going to continue trespassing on my property?" I asked, wanting absolute clarity on her intentions. "I am going to continue using community resources as I see fit," she replied. "If you cannot handle that, maybe you should move somewhere else." That was the moment everything changed. Margaret had made her position crystal clear. She felt entitled to my property, would continue violating it, and would use her HOA authority to punish me for objecting. Legal channels would be slow and expensive, while her violations would continue every weekend. As I walked out of her office, my mind was already working on a different solution. Margaret Wilson wanted to play games with my property. She wanted to test my boundaries and see what I would do about it. She was about to find out that some people fight back in ways she never expected. The next phase of this war would be fought on my terms, in my territory, with rules she did not even know existed. That night, I sat in my violated cabin and made a decision that would change everything. Margaret Wilson wanted to treat my property like her personal playground. She would get exactly what she deserved, but not in any way she could predict or control. I spent the next week researching creative security measures that would be memorable but not dangerous. The internet was full of ideas from homeowners who had dealt with persistent trespassers. Motion-activated sprinklers, harmless but startling alarms, and various surprise deterrents that would teach lessons without causing injury. The key was making sure everything was completely legal while being absolutely unforgettable. I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in property rights, and he confirmed that homeowners have broad authority to protect their property with reasonable measures. As long as nothing was designed to cause injury, I was within my rights to install whatever security systems I deemed necessary. My first installation was a series of motion-activated sprinkler systems around the perimeter. These commercial-grade units were designed for wildlife deterrent, but they would work perfectly for unwanted human visitors. The moment someone crossed onto my property, they would trigger a cascade of water jets that would soak them thoroughly. Next, I installed air horns connected to pressure plates at key entry points. These marine-grade horns were loud enough to be heard for miles and would provide an instant alarm system that would startle anyone attempting unauthorized entry. The sound would be shocking but completely harmless. For the interior, I set up a series of harmless but memorable surprises. Motion-activated cameras that would flash bright lights and play loud recordings of guard dog barking. Fake security keypads that would trigger when touched, activating sirens and flashing lights throughout the cabin. The porch received special attention. I installed pressure-sensitive boards that would trigger various sound effects when stepped on. Creaking sounds, breaking glass noises, and alarm bells would create an atmosphere of chaos for anyone attempting to use my space without permission. But my masterpiece was the front door. I rigged it with a system that would dump a bucket of washable paint on anyone who opened it without disarming the security system first. The paint was completely harmless, but would mark trespassers for identification and create an unforgettable experience. I spent days testing and refining each system. Every trap was carefully calibrated to be startling and memorable without causing injury. The goal was education, not harm. Margaret and her friends would learn that actions have consequences, even when they think no one is watching. The security camera system was upgraded to include night vision and motion tracking. Multiple angles would capture everything that happened on my property, creating an undeniable record of any future violations. This time, I would have evidence that no one could dispute or dismiss. As I made final adjustments to my security measures, I felt a satisfaction I had not experienced in years. For the first time since Margaret began her reign of HOA terror, I was taking control. Instead of being a victim of her entitled behavior, I was becoming the architect of her consequences. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. Margaret could continue threatening me with HOA violations and neighborhood retaliation, but none of that would help her when she triggered my carefully prepared surprises. Her authority meant nothing on my property, where my rules applied and her entitlement would meet its match. I installed signs warning about security systems and surveillance cameras. These legal notices would protect me from any claims of unfair surprise, while making it clear that the property was actively monitored and protected. Anyone who chose to trespass after seeing these warnings would be doing so with full knowledge of potential consequences. The final touch was a new lock system with rolling codes that changed daily. Even if Margaret had somehow obtained a key to my old lock, she would find herself locked out and forced to trigger my exterior security measures if she attempted to enter. Everything was ready. My violated sanctuary had been transformed into a fortress of justice, where entitled behavior would meet carefully planned consequences. Margaret Wilson wanted to test my boundaries and see what I would do when pushed too far. She was about to find out. The next weekend was approaching, and based on her pattern, Margaret would be returning with her party guests. But this time, instead of finding an undefended cabin to exploit, she would discover that some violations come with prices that entitled people never expect to pay. Saturday evening, my phone buzzed with the first motion detector alert. I was home in the suburbs, but my security system was sending live video feeds directly to my device. Margaret Wilson was back, leading another group of entitled neighbors up my mountain road like she owned the place. I watched in anticipation as 20 people piled out of multiple vehicles, carrying coolers, folding chairs, and portable speakers. Margaret pointed toward the cabin with the same casual authority she had shown in the previous footage. Her voice carried clearly through the audio system. "Same rules as last time, everyone. Make yourselves at home. The owner never shows up anyway." Her confident arrogance was about to meet my carefully prepared reality. The first surprise triggered when Margaret stepped onto the porch. The pressure-sensitive board activated immediately, releasing a recording of breaking glass followed by an air horn blast that echoed across the mountains. Margaret jumped backward with a shriek, colliding with the person behind her. "What was that?" someone yelled. Before Margaret could answer, the motion-activated sprinkler system detected the crowd and erupted in a coordinated water assault. 6 high-pressure jets soaked everyone within 30 feet of the cabin, drenching their clothes and sending them scrambling for cover. Margaret stood dripping wet, her perfectly styled hair plastered to her head, her expensive outfit ruined. But her entitlement was stronger than her discomfort. She wiped water from her eyes and marched toward the front door with renewed determination. "Someone is playing games with us," she announced to her soggy followers. "But I have a key, and we are going inside." The moment Margaret turned the key and opened the door, my masterpiece activated. 3 gallons of washable purple paint cascaded from the bucket system I had rigged above the entrance. The paint covered Margaret from head to toe, transforming the HOA president into a dripping purple mess. Her scream of rage and disbelief echoed through the mountains as she stood in the doorway, paint dripping from her hair and clothing. Her followers stared in shock at their fearless leader, now looking like she had been attacked by a giant grape. But the surprises were not finished. Margaret's movement into the cabin triggered the interior motion sensors, activating flashing strobe lights and a recording of aggressive guard dogs barking at maximum volume. The sound was so loud and startling that Margaret stumbled backward, slipping on the paint-slicked doorway and landing hard on the porch. "This is war," Margaret screamed, struggling to stand on the slippery surface. "Whoever did this will pay." Her attempts to rally her party guests fell flat as more security measures activated around the property. Anyone who moved toward the cabin triggered additional sprinkler systems, creating an ever-expanding zone of chaos and confusion. The air horns continued blasting randomly, making conversation impossible and adding to the general pandemonium. One guest tried to approach through the side yard, only to trigger a motion-activated scarecrow that popped up with flashing lights and a recording of horror movie screams. Another person attempted to circle around back, setting off a series of pressure plate alarms that created a cacophony of bells, whistles, and sirens. Margaret, still covered in purple paint and soaking wet, tried to maintain control of the situation. But her authority meant nothing in the face of mechanical systems that responded only to physics and programming. Every step she took triggered new surprises, new humiliations, new demonstrations that her entitlement had finally met its match. "Everyone back to the cars," Margaret finally commanded, her voice cracking with frustration and embarrassment. "We are leaving." But even retreat was not simple. The motion sensors followed their movement, triggering a farewell symphony of alarms, sprinklers, and sound effects that chased them all the way to their vehicles. Margaret slipped twice more on the wet ground, adding grass stains to her paint-covered outfit. As the cars pulled away, I watched Margaret through my security cameras, sitting in her driver's seat covered in purple paint, her hair dripping, her dignity in ruins. The woman who had spent years using her authority to intimidate and control others had just experienced what it felt like to be completely powerless. But I knew this was not over. Margaret Wilson was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. Her next move would be predictable. She would try to use official channels to punish me for embarrassing her. She would discover that some battles cannot be won with threats and authority alone. Monday morning, my phone rang at 7 a.m. The caller ID showed the county sheriff's office. Margaret had wasted no time in trying to turn the tables, but she had made a critical mistake. She had underestimated the power of documented evidence. "We received a complaint about booby traps and assault," the deputy explained. "We need to discuss what happened at your cabin this weekend." "I would be happy to discuss it," I replied calmly. "I have extensive video documentation of everything that occurred on my property." 30 minutes later, Deputy Martinez sat in my living room, reviewing the security footage on my laptop. He watched Margaret leading her group onto my property, listened to her casual admission of repeated trespassing, and observed the perfect operation of my harmless but effective security systems. "So let me understand this correctly," the deputy said. "She has been breaking into your cabin for months, holding unauthorized parties and damaging your property. You installed legal security measures to protect your home. When she returned to trespass again, your systems worked exactly as designed." "That is correct," I confirmed. "Everything on my property is designed to deter trespassers without causing injury. The paint is washable, the sprinklers use water, and the sound systems are no louder than construction equipment." Deputy Martinez reviewed Margaret's official complaint, which painted her as an innocent victim of a vicious assault. But the video evidence told a completely different story. Her own words documented her intent to continue trespassing, while my security systems had responded to illegal entry exactly as they were designed to do. "Mrs. Wilson seems to have left out some important details in her report," the deputy observed with a slight smile. "Trespassing is a serious offense, especially when it involves breaking and entering and property damage." The investigation expanded quickly once other neighbors learned what had happened. Margaret's attempted retaliation backfired spectacularly, as people who had suffered under her HOA tyranny came forward with their own stories of abuse and overreach. Within days, the local news picked up the story. The image of an entitled HOA president covered in purple paint became a viral sensation, representing everything people hated about petty authority figures who believed rules did not apply to them. Margaret's carefully constructed image of respectability crumbled as her pattern of abuse was exposed to public scrutiny. But the legal consequences were just beginning. The documented evidence of repeated trespassing, breaking and entering, and property damage created a clear case for criminal charges. Margaret's position as HOA president offered no protection against property crime, and her threats of retaliation only made things worse. The Homeowners Association board held an emergency meeting to address the scandal. Margaret's fellow board members, facing their own liability for her actions, quickly distanced themselves from her behavior. The woman who had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist suddenly found herself abandoned by the very people who had enabled her abuse. My lawyer confirmed what I already knew. My actions had been completely justified under property protection laws. The security measures were reasonable, non-dangerous, and clearly marked with warning signs. Margaret had knowingly trespassed on protected property and suffered the natural consequences of her illegal actions. The satisfaction of watching Margaret's carefully constructed authority collapse was sweeter than I had imagined. For years, she had used her position to intimidate and control others, secure in the belief that her power made her untouchable. But power that depends on fear and manipulation crumbles quickly when exposed to truth and consequences. The community that had once feared Margaret's retaliation now saw her for what she really was, a bully whose authority had finally met its match. Her threats and intimidation tactics lost all power once people understood that she was not above the law, and that standing up to bullies was not only possible but necessary. 3 months later, Margaret Wilson was no longer the HOA president. The Homeowners Association board had voted unanimously to remove her from office following the trespassing scandal and the subsequent investigation into her pattern of abuse. The woman who had terrorized our neighborhood for 8 years was finally facing consequences for her actions. The legal resolution was swift and decisive. Margaret pled guilty to criminal trespassing and property damage charges, receiving a hefty fine and community service sentence. More importantly, she was required to pay full restitution for all damages to my cabin, including the cost of professional cleaning and repair work. But the financial consequences were minor compared to the destruction of her reputation and authority. The viral video of Margaret covered in purple paint had made her a laughingstock, a symbol of entitled behavior meeting its inevitable comeuppance. Her carefully cultivated image as a responsible community leader was permanently shattered. The new HOA board implemented significant reforms to prevent future abuse of authority. Term limits, oversight committees, and clear boundaries on presidential power replaced the unchecked control that had allowed Margaret to terrorize residents for years. The Homeowners Association began functioning as it was meant to serving the community rather than controlling it. My cabin sanctuary was finally restored to its intended purpose. The peace and solitude I had worked so hard to create returned, unmarred by the knowledge that entitled trespassers felt free to violate my space. The security systems remained in place, but they no longer felt necessary. They were simply insurance against future boundary violations. The community response to my stand against Margaret was overwhelmingly positive. Neighbors who had suffered under her reign of petty tyranny expressed gratitude that someone had finally held her accountable. The story became a rallying cry for property rights and individual freedom against authoritarian overreach. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the transformation of Margaret herself. The woman who had once strutted through the neighborhood issuing citations and threats now walked with her head down, avoiding eye contact with the people she had once intimidated. Her entitlement and arrogance had been replaced by the quiet shame of someone who had finally faced consequences for their actions. The lesson of this experience extended far beyond one entitled HOA president and her abuse of authority. It demonstrated that bullies depend on the compliance and fear of their victims to maintain power. When someone finally stands up and fights back intelligently and legally, that power evaporates like morning mist. My mountain cabin remained a sanctuary, but it had become something more, a symbol of the principle that boundaries matter, that private property deserves protection, and that entitled behavior will eventually meet its match. The peace I found there was deeper now, earned through struggle and validated by justice. Looking back on those months of violation and the satisfaction of ultimate vindication, I realized that Margaret Wilson had done me an unexpected favor. Her attack on my sanctuary had forced me to discover my own strength and ingenuity. Her entitled behavior had revealed the power of careful preparation and intelligent resistance. The mountains still offered their eternal peace, but now that peace was protected by more than isolation and hope. It was secured by the knowledge that some boundaries are worth defending, some violations demand consequences, and some battles are worth fighting when the cause is just. Margaret Wilson had taught me that entitled people will take whatever they can get away with, until someone finally makes them stop. Sometimes the best defense is not backing down, but fighting back smarter than your opponent expects. The cabin stands secure, the peace restored, and the lesson learned. Justice served, one purple-painted trespasser at a time.